Welcome to the Green Ring, and thanks for watching. This video is first in a series of 8 presenting a note-by-note analysis of Wagner's Das Rheingold Scene 2. Built on nearly 2 centuries of scholarly literature, its massive journey of enlightenment aspires to scan the entirety of Der Ring des Nibelungen to its final note. I hope you'll take this voyage with me when I hope I'll be able to complete. For an explanation of who I am and more on the reasons for this series, please check out my preface video. Its link is supplied below, along with those for the other videos preceding this one, which include all of Rheingold Scene 1. We pick up where we left off as Rheingold Scene 2 begins, in Dover's full score on page 84. Per stage instructions, the interlude's mists clear during the last measures to reveal Valhalla in the distance, Wotan and Fricka foreground, sleeping on a mountaintop. They're instructed to remain motionless as all but one Valhalla morpheme sounds on tubas. It's the first time in Rheingold brass dominates the orchestra, lacking only strummed harpchord punctuations and low-string minim tremolo pulses ended by quaver strokes. These string figures initiate the first measures of 2 Part 1 strophes. Then minims become crotchets, the first 4 measures of the Part 1b variant, which follows, introducing the complete static world-ash interval most typical of Valhalla itself. The module's last 2 measures trade the low string figures for its equivalent on timpani, while trombones, trumpets swell the tubas. Contrabass, trombone, and tuba add an intriguing sidelight as they juxtapose alternating high-ash intervals with their dire inverted versions, a kind of balancing act reminiscent of the great tree's Götterdämmerung appearance as Wotan prepares to shatter its equilibrium. Another complete duo of Part 1 iterations on its heels exhibits several interesting variants. The first pulse is strong, even triumphant, while the second is much softer, its orchestration light as compared to the first strophe. As intriguing, this second iteration shifts momentarily into minor mode, then back to major, the Earth Mother's shadow passing over the work's second great power symbol. Part 2 follows, 2 pulses only, its first appearance of a mere handful during the epic. The reason for this doesn't reveal itself quickly, but turns on its reverse air-to melody notes. A hint resides in the static ash intervals peppering it, exactly as they've just done the Part 1b variant, a module founded on the melody notes in their original form. Ultimately, the god's bid to keep hold of the world ash's power devolves into something quite different from his mighty fortress, an undertaking in which reverse melody notes come to play an important role. The passage concludes on Valhalla Part 3, with its procession of air chords, the melody notes themselves, and a world ash interval punctuated by its Valhalla incarnation. It should be noted the only Valhalla module not heard during this initial catalog is its Part 4, what Cook dubs the Valhalla cadence, that world ash syntax including its pure interval, meaning on an octave. Lacking this one piece of the syntactic puzzle, the interlude's conclusion and its Valhalla development launching Scene 2 impart a great deal more information than conveyed by mist projected on a scrim which parts to reveal a citadel. Having created his ring, Albrecht dreams of world domination, a reverie which morphs into Wotan's fantasies of his own similar plan. Like Albrecht, the god achieves his designs by raping nature, but still, in an unconscious or perhaps better a preconscious state, he visualizes his grand enterprise as a bouquet conforming to his own personal image of world power. This is represented syntactically by the Valhalla morpheme complex, which is far more involved than simply the ring transformation from which Valhalla Part 1 arises, not to mention shot through with a host of associations evoking nature and its energies. This alone suggests that, dire as the Nibelung's ambitions may be, the threat they pose Erda's world is meager beside the gods. A harp arpeggio rises through the final brass pedal of Valhalla Part 3, rudely interrupted by a downward demi-semiquaver rush on second violins, cellos, as Fricka disturbs her consort's magisterial contemplation by singing his name to a descending sixth, bouncing on thirds, to finish with a rising fifth, and air to chord notes on Erwache. Stage directions and musical syntax leave no doubt she fails to rouse him as he basks in his dream for a few more measures. It's no surprise the god's vocal is rich in syntax, his first utterance in the ring sung atop a unique and individually specific evolution of the ring morpheme. Wotan begins with a static ash interval. As discussed earlier, variants of that elemental morpheme pervade the Valhalla syntax as a whole to stress the fortress as repository for the mighty tree's energy stolen by Wotan through his spear. He continues his line in a dipping rising module which bears a strong resemblance to the Rhine Maidens, yet is also built on the heroic notes, ending the Erde melody, a module he then repeats. Quick ears will hear in these two figures an early pre-echo of the Valkyrie syntax, a line he concludes after falling a third with the heroic rising fifth. This downward third rising fifth combination has already echoed in Alberich's Scene 1 Passion as well as in the Ring's Allure, and continues to play a telling role in the work's syntax. Two ring strophes underscore the god's vocal in their indeterminate major mode form minted during the interlude, which here cellos take whole. But to reinforce the immortal's sense of superiority over Alberich's less noble schemes, each iteration extends the cello's melody notes by repeating a second overlapping pulse of them on violas, making two rising scales of 5 notes each. This interesting variance overlap here resolves itself in time to become yet another important morpheme, one naturally derived from the ring with intimations of quite a different urge to power. Yet, as the syntax of the god's vocal implies, these opposing impulses aren't entirely different. The orchestra continues with 2 strophes of Valhalla Part 1's variant on brass choir, itself a melody note derivation that immediately echoes its prior strophe, cellos divided in 4 as their bass ground. The thought completes in a shortened version of Valhalla Part 3, whose concluding high ash interval this time rises on the upward third destined to become its wonted interval. Atop this Valhalla bundle, Wotan sings an inversion of the heroic melody notes, then Ewige Macht on reverse melody notes, capped by a descending Erde fourth in opposition to the original melody notes of the orchestra, meaning the Valhalla Part 1 pulse immediately preceding it. This subtle hint suggests the future conflict of these two basic syntactic modules throughout the drama, in the form of Wotan's ultimate, if as yet unborn, stratagem to outmaneuver Erde, never mind Alberich's racial urges which so dominate Scene 1. The Immortal's words to this brief passage are especially enlightening. Mannes Ehre, ewige Macht, ragen zu endlosem Ruhm. Wotan already harbors an image, however vague, of mortal races, Mannes Ehre, to carry on his world rule, a subtly misogynist concept thanks to the word Mannes, sung on that inversion of the heroic melody notes. His vocals throughout this initial phase, introducing Valhalla modules, are redolent of another important group of syntactic clues. It's of particular note this module concludes by echoing his initial vocal on 2 back-to-back strophes of that portion of Erde's morpheme which Cook points out generates much of the work's distinctive heroic syntax, its second iteration bringing his reverie to a close as cellos subtly creep up a rising triad with its charge of ambivalence, even betrayal. Beneath a strong woodwind horn chord, second violins, cellos interrupt him with a hectic downward scale whose demi-semiquavers, capped by semiquavers, outline a reverse Erde melody note pulse followed by its elongation. This merges directly into a demi-semi-quaver chord note opposition, finished on melody notes, a bundle of contradictions triggering Fricka's second appeal to her drowsy spouse, which at last rouses him. Begun over the last of the string phrase, her vocal is surprisingly dense in syntax, a falling tritone, a melody note opposition, separated by a rising third, which continues after a third descent into that scene 1 module implying reversals of expectations. After a quaver rest, she sings Erwache, exactly as before, to a rising fifth, and chord notes, capped by yet another chagrin pulse, this time on a tritone with which she urges him to erwäge. None of it seems to trouble the god who opens his eyes on Valhalla to the first ever spear iteration on low strings, albeit in an untypical combination of crotchets and quavers subtly tinged with chromatics, mark of Loge's covert subversion of Wotan's power schemes. Naturally enough, this leads to another extended chain of the fortress's morphemes as the waking god praises his brainchild with florid rhetoric, which includes one particularly telling comment, wie im Träum ich ihn trug, wie mein Wille ihn wies, in answer to Fricka, who in waking him has just stated, auf aus der Träume, wonigen trug. Taking these verbal clues alongside the interlude's transformation of the ring into Valhalla, the god's conception is undermined with ambiguity from the instant it appears. Syntactically, the passage begins with 2 strophes of Valhalla Part 1, the god's vocal begun atop the second of them. Wotan's line, launched by a rising to fourth, follows a slightly broader but still easily recognizable outline of the Whirldash vocal, sung by the Norns, here unmistakably establishing its link to Valhalla Part 1. The god's vocal also underlines the ring's descending first half, while eschewing its melody notes for a reversal of its first half, following, thus opposing the melody notes in the brass choir with that rising triad's subtle sense of betrayal. This vocal cell turns on a syncopated down-up to fourth, yet another of those subtle embryonic details to grow in meaning as the epic continues. The passage as a whole emphasizes its roots in the work's sonic DNA, with fully 8 instances of the long-short-long rhythmic pulse, completed by a tonic-dominant-tonic harmonic strophe. Not surprisingly, then, 3 Whirldash intervals are smoothly folded into the orchestra, 1 reverse and 2 high. Interestingly, Wotan's vocal includes both a falling triad, pre-echoed in the orchestra, and its rising mirror, both cells which play major roles in Scene 1, the falling triad to describe Albrecht's nascent urge towards racial change through his lust, which he transforms into the ring, and the rising one from the nymph's constant thoughtless betrayals, which goad him to that terrible expedient. All the elements of this telling sequence are discussed in those videos, and here they suggest nature's power throbbing within the fortress, an impression strengthened by the remainder of the god's encomium to his castle. With this, the god's tribute also begins by slyly incorporating allusions to a conflict between his vision and Albrecht's, of which he's as yet unaware, one destined to bring down his mighty scheme. It launches an almost identical replay of the scene's first Valhalla morpheme presentation, meaning a strophe of the Part 1 variant with its static ash intervals, 2 more pulses of Valhalla Part 1, the second beginning in minor, to quickly shift back to major, Erda again, and an iteration of Valhalla Part 3. Missing is Valhalla Part 2, which, as discussed, repeats only a few times, and not during this episode. At this point in the drama, the ideas embodied in its reversed melody notes remain unformed, the conflict it's meant to resolve yet to come. Instead, it's replaced by a third oddly distorted Part 1 strophe, more on which in a moment. Wotan's vocal line is equally revealing as it moves into a pair of echoing phrases, both launched by static ash intervals. The first concludes on Die Götterberg as he bounces up, then down to fourth. The last shaped as a dire inverted ash interval, yet another cell looking forward to what will come. After a crotchet rest, he moves up a third into the next static ash interval, capped by his quasi-Valkyrie line, with its morpheme-generating heroic last portion of the Erda melody. As intriguing as the rest, atop another Valhalla Part 1 strophe, the god doubles only the morpheme's falling line, meaning its ring fragment in major mode. Given Valhalla Part 1 is the major mode version of the ring, this major mode version of the fragment only recurs, either vocally or orchestrally, in a single other instance in the epic. That's apt, given Alberich and God pursue their struggles for world power by quite different means. The second Valhalla Part 1 iteration sounds in minor mode, his vocal again following its fragment, the Earth's Mother's shadow repeatedly drifting across his grand design. Not surprisingly, both Wotan's fragment vocals are shaped as paired reverse ash intervals, and their words are also revealing. The major mode iteration on Wie in Träum ich in Trug, the minor Wie mein Wille in Wies. So long as it's a dream, Valhalla can do no harm, but once the god's harsh will makes it a reality, catastrophe strikes. From there, the brass choir proceeds to a distorted Valhalla Part 1 strophe, begun with Erda chords echoed in Wotan's vocal line as chord notes. Once he concludes the phrase, a Valkyrie bounce, rising in another heroic module to echo the others, the brass continue with Valhalla Part 3 and its repeated Erda chords. This builds to the sequence climax, the first ever Valhalla Part 4 iteration, Cook's Valhalla cadence. For greater clarity, this more detailed resume breaks across 5 staves to precisely focus its syntactic elements. An audience's attention is naturally on Wotan's vocal, begun with an eerie plunging octave, which he follows with a pure ash interval, this one on a massive upward jump of a tenth. It's as if to boldly erase the dire plunging octave he's just sung by overreaching even the world ash itself, the 2 wide intervals back-to-back emphasizing the god's unparalleled vitality. He concludes on the rising triad, the phrase as a whole like a retrograde of the Rheinbind's insouciant figure. His vocals' placement over the orchestra has its own tale to tell. Under the god's falling octave, the brass choir begins on the last Erda chords of Valhalla Part 3, to finish by supporting him with its version of the high ash interval in its most wonted form, a rising third, though the second trombone expresses this as the heroic rising fifth. Matching Wotan's overcompensated world ash interval, these merge into Erda chords beneath the spear bass in lowest brass, as the epic's first unmistakable pure world ash interval sounds on a trumpet in its most striking, pristine, and nature-centric form, meaning a rising octave, whose 2 final notes take the higher register, as in the Norn's depiction of the great tree. What makes this moment especially galvanic is the god's vocal anticipation of the interval immediately prior to the cadence itself. This makes for a dual interval pulse, as in the Rheingold fanfare, identifying the god's fortress with gold as similar repositories of nature's greatest powers. His vocal conclusion, the rising triad, with its sense of abandonment and betrayal, synchronizes exactly and ominously with the trumpet's world ash interval, never mind that of the Rheingold fanfare itself. Holding his final note on the word bow, Valhalla Part 4 proceeds to its conclusion over a soft timpani roll, the trumpet sounding, a module which at this point an audience can only associate with Alberich's grief at being denied love. Given their attention to other matters, however, it's unlikely any but the sharpest ear notices. Beneath it, third trumpet trombones, sounds of Valhalla ash interval, immediately followed by third trombone joining in for another static interval pulse in its pure form. With the passage's resolution on the tonic, a timpani roll builds to crescendo together with the brass choir's pedal chord as harps lift in a series of downward arpeggios, while the third trumpet, trombones, and contrabass tuba cap the sequence by thundering a last and particularly magnificent static ash interval, nature's power safely stowed in Valhalla's ironclad pawns. It's worth noting the complete change this second scene's opening works in the syntactic language, despite being built entirely upon what's come before in scene 1. The Meister wanted a wholly different sound to mark the change between the Rhine's primal freedom and the regimented world of the gods. The brass choir dominates, which has been virtually absent from the texture since the prelude, while the march-like rhythms entirely lack the plasticity of scene 1. The result is a strict, even stiff inhibition of the work's syntactic DNA, as if straitjacketing nature into Wotan's power-motivated vision of the world, a syntactic bounty that has intertwined so freely during scene 1. This comes to a remarkable head in the Valhalla cadence, where mighty grandeur blossoms side by side with ominous hints of potential disaster in this great fortress and the creatures destined to inhabit it. Fricka now launches the first of Rheingold Scene 2's conversations built on quasi-recitative vocal lines, punctuated by syntax-neutral chords, strategically interspersed with key morphemes. This first dialogue with her immortal consort, by far the longest of them. One can't help thinking Brian McGee is thinking specifically of this sequence when he opines, "When Wagner formulated a theory of opera that set music and words on an equal footing, he was stacking the cards against his own talents. And when he kept faith with this theory in the composition of a whole opera, the Rheingold, he was confining his genius in chains." McGee disparages Rheingold several more times on this count, but surely in error. So early in the epic, a quasi-recitative technique is simply good sense. Audiences can't follow the narrative without grasping its poem's dense complex of ideas, while building decisive associations with its musical syntax. The Meister judiciously rations the introduction of new morphemes, while constantly stressing that which is already familiar. The syntactic modules so far identified in the vocal lines continue to appear, of course, and no doubt may be criticized as mere flights of my imagination, particularly since the light orchestral texture gives them what might be dismissed as undue emphasis. Yet the precision of the meaning so far imputed to them maintains such a remarkable consistency throughout the dialogue, such criticism seems off the mark. Apart from its narrative and syntactic utility, this quasi-recitative section has a subtler dramatic function as well. Scene 1 has been a riotous kaleidoscope of sonic riches, a ceaseless forward-moving panorama of nature's bounty. Scene 2 begins with an equivalent wealth in its Valhalla syntax, but in marked contrast to everything that's come before. While resplendent, it's stiff, harshly ordered, unyielding. Proceeding from it, this austere dialogue stealthily emphasizes the god's rigid world, one that's as close to being barren as Wagner ever comes in any of his works. Only when the drama's nature elements again intrude, meaning Freya, the giants, and Loge, does it blossom towards something like Scene 1's generosity of spirit and declamation. An audience isn't likely to put this together consciously, but can't help assimilating it subconsciously, leading to sighs of relief each time the more florid sequences arrive. As a covert mark of this not-so-brave new world, the meter changes to common time, its first presence in the epic for any duration, which makes it a subtle reminder of renunciation of love, the first time that meter ever sounds. Fricka begins by countering Wotan's protracted elation with her fears. A single quaver string chord punctuates the end of her initial phrase, one that rises and ere the fourth to fall an inverted ash interval, only the third vocal appearance of this baleful cell, albeit mollified by sinking on chord notes. Lacking only its ash interval, this rising fifth chord note module is precisely the syntax with which she's already twice goaded Wotan to Erwache. Fricka then sketches a broad rising-falling turn built on a melody note opposition, that module which, in Scene 1, hints at one of the ring's world-shaping aspects. It also bears a passing resemblance to giant syntax, whose threat is Fricka's current underlying worry, a syntactic resemblance which isn't coincidental. Going on to cast shade on his elation with melody notes, after a quaver rest she drops a poignant sixth, as, pinpointing her specific concern, she rises a third to sing the word Freya on chord notes, inspiring a gentle string pedal chord. Falling an air to fourth and rising on melody notes, she urges Wotan to think of what he's pledged as the fortress's payment, Lass dich erinnern, developing into a chord note opposition. She completes her phrase by rising a third, then moves through a static ash interval into Flosshilda's heroic resistance, here equivocated by its rising tritone. This triggers low strings to slide down the next spare iteration, this time in something closer to its definitive incarnation, as Fricka sings an impressively confrontational challenge. The morpheme is typically a descending scale begun on a robust sustained note, in this case a crotchet, moving in quavers to be postponed by long-short-long syncopation. Incidentally, this highlights that it follows reverse arida melody notes, a standard part of the spear that invariably slows the morpheme's following notes to a series of magisterial crotchets. Always heard in the orchestra alone, when it supports a vocal, the morpheme usually launches words either atop or immediately following its swift modules, the distinctive melody note rhythm acting both as an associative identifier and a kind of propellant. In this case, Fricka begins on an air to fourth to intone a sinisterly altered static ash interval, its final long pulse, a reproachful falling octave on fertig, to lend it that interval's ominous baggage of misused power. She moves to a low ash interval, distorting its short pulse as two semiquavers, then ends on reverse chord notes. Volkswagen was first to misconstrue the spear morpheme by labeling it treaty, based largely on this wrangle with Wotan over the implications of his pact with the giants, his mistake probably abetted by the morpheme's prominence in the blood brotherhood oath of Götterdämmerung. Kobe's preferred moniker is compact, still in agreement with Volkswagen, and Newman endorses them both. Hutchison breaks with this tradition by recognizing the morpheme as exclusive to the spear's power. Cook settles the matter, and Holman agrees, but Sabor falls back into the old confusion. Even so, the jury is in. The spear itself unequivocally gives Wotan access to the natural energy now locked in Valhalla. Before the fortress is built to house it, that power resides in the spear alone, which the god uses to seal his bargain with the giants. The spear's influence must logically transcend this one pact, since the weapon is etched with runes defining his prerogatives, not merely for treaties, but over the entire world. Relegating the spear's meaning solely to the Rheingold treaty, or indeed treaties in general, reduces it to little more than a colorful wrinkle, which it certainly is not. Its syntax reverberates largely unchanged throughout the epic, always to indicate Wotan's ill-gotten potency in a host of different situations, and it's this power the morpheme portrays. Asking if what he's risked for the castle is forgotten, Fricka intones an inverted ash interval on chord notes and a chord note opposition, which she caps with a harsh rising tritone, which sparks timpani in a Valhalla ash interval grace on the giant thump, to leave no doubt what she means. As the timpani fade on three quavers spaced by rests, her consort parries that he remembers well enough, a downward tritone in his voice to answer her rising one, from which he lifts on melody notes a module very like something heard in Albrecht's vocals during Scene 1. Wotan's capping fifth descent here leads it to its inversion, marking chagrin. The future reveals this syntactic combination adheres primarily to Loge at his most duplicitous. The immortal proceeds on a rising triad, its hint of betrayal enriched with a low-ash interval followed by two ominous descending fifths. Atop another spear pulse on low strings, he goes on deflecting her with the claim his bargain zent the giants. His vocal rises an erde fourth to move through static notes including an ash interval, followed by its reverse on chord notes, as he brands their race a trotzig Gesicht, a pungent irony given it's the gods' treachery that soon endangers their relations. After a quaver rest, he heaps more praise on Valhalla, launched with static notes, then an up-down bounce on erde fourth to rise a sixth in a distortion of Albrecht's Fury, another nascent morpheme. From there, he inverts the melody's final notes and caps them with another plunging fifth, the whole phrase a syntactic indictment of his own duplicity. Once his minim vocal rest begins a third octavo low string spear iteration, he follows atop it by singing Die steht nun on a rising erde fourth and plunging octave, an instant if subtle accusation echoing Fricka's use of the octave for her Fertig, describing the fortress complete, its note come due. He thanks the giants to another static ash interval rounded off by a poignant descending sixth, then tells her not to worry about the payment, meaning Freya, with a chord note opposition, separated by a sinking fourth, a module distorting Albrecht's embryonic version of Freya. Goaded in this brazenly intolerable way, his wife's arresting response helps solidify one of the tetralogy's most important morphemes. Second violin viola tremolos and hectic first violins twice rush up demi-semiquaver scales then once down to punctuate her emotional turmoil. The operative syntax resides in Fricka's vocal, 3 back-to-back pulses of a module which sounds embryonically in Scene 1 during Albrecht's failed courtship of Velgunde and frequently repeats thereafter, always in vocal lines and with a passing resemblance to a key cell of the Rhine Maiden's joy syntax. Fricka twice begins the phrase on a tritone, each time rising on erde melody notes. These first two pulses she ends on chord notes, which plangent woodwinds echo in the form of the chords themselves. However, her last phrase begins on a descending fifth, its melody notes finished without chord notes, aligning it to the syntactic form which conveys its opposition to Wotan's plans as the tetralogy extends beyond Rheingold. Her next phrase, asserting she would have stopped him, descants on this key syntactic module in that, after a rising third, she echoes it by descending another fifth on an inverted ash interval, her voice continuing with a chord note opposition capped by a rising erde fourth. From the outset, Fricka identifies herself as Wotan's foe, which she expands by underlining the similarities between the objectives of dwarf and god. Doch mutig entferntet ihr Männer die Frauen, taub und ruhig vor uns allein mit den Riesen zu tagen. One can't help but think of the dwarfs' treatment of the Rhine maidens, though the comment's full implications are too early in the drama for an audience to grasp. But as the narrative develops, Wotan's callous treatment of his women grows to a crushing burden of guilt which progressively aligns him with his dwarfish counterpart. Over 2 string pedal chords, Fricka intones the above-quoted words by rising an erde fourth, only to fall on the same interval, then move through static notes into a rising scale, meaning extended melody notes, the bundle thus implying her outrage, with the distortion of her nascent just voice defiance morpheme. She descends from it through a distorted heroic melody note inversion, a stark tritone on the word Frauen. After a semiquaver rest, she bounces up and down fourths and rises a sixth, an echo of Albrecht's Fury, to continue in a flattened Rhine Maiden bounce, its descending notes yet another erde inversion, its rising interval a third. By continuing the previous line's ascending third with another above it, she begins her next phrase as the completion of a rising triad, with its sense of betrayal and abandonment on the words "vor uns allein," finishing the idea with another rising fourth and chord note opposition, which becomes reversed melody notes. After a crotchet rest, introducing a gentle string pedal chord, Fricka's bitterness increases on more reversed melody notes, syncopated as in the spear to lift on its heroic melody note conclusion, only to fall through another set of reversed melody notes, the last two expanded to resemble chord notes. Emphasized by a sforzando chord, she intones her sister Freya's name to a pathetically descending sixth, describing how she was bartered away, which she sings on melody notes, topped by chord notes to create an echo of her earlier scold, a module gradually acquiring a sense of implacable resistance to Wotan's agenda. After a mere semiquaver rest, she indicts the male gods Schächergewerbs, with a low ash interval rising a third, followed by a cell evoking the Rhine maiden's own irresponsible pleasure in their gold. She is punctuated by another outraged first violin demi-semiquaver uprush, which galvanizes a second violin viola tremolo, supporting her lament's conclusion. Voice initially falling on extended reverse melody notes, then their pure version, which create fleeting shadows of renunciation of love, the last capped with reverse chord notes. Prepared by low strings rushing down a demi-semiquaver scale into a sting across the string choir, she finishes on the words "Giert ihr Männer nach Mach" by intoning a pair of rising triads with their growing sense of treachery, a figure not unlike her husband's, though here a diminished followed by a minor. Over softened viola tremolos and an octave contrabass pedal, a single pulse of the interlude's gentle major mode ring version sighs reassuringly on cellos, prefaced to Wotan's response mildly chiding his consort for wanting the fortress as much as he. His vocal outlines a version of the ring syntax, its falling notes reduced to a single Welt Arab triad, from which he moves through a static ash interval into its melody notes, capped by a downward fifth to create a sense of chagrin. After a quaver rest, he continues by rocking up and down on thirds, another forward-looking syntactic presentiment of divine vitality, as horns 1 and 2 breathe another ring strophe over third horn's pedal. He doubles its melody notes, then falls silence for a quaver and minim, as horns continue their rise on a second pulse of the melody note fragment, extending it with a third and last melody note pulse into a scale similar to his earlier extension, if 2 notes longer. This spear-opposing scalar ascent is a nascent module, destined to have far-reaching influence on the frustration of Wotan's plans, one already hinted at by Renunciation of Love, specifically when Voglinde hints at the magic necessary to forge the ring. Atop a soft octavo cello pedal, sweet tremolo violins, violas move through poignant chording to support her vocal as Fricka clarifies her motive was to ensure her consort's fidelity. This first hint of what must be the god's already multiple infidelities thus initiates the scene's first vague shadow of Scene 1's natural fecundity. She begins with a pair of song-like phrases, each broken into questions and answers. The questioning phrases initiate on extended melody notes that rise in seductive chromatics to then fall in interval, making them chagrin distortions, after which each is subtly elaborated. Her first questioning phrase ends by dropping an air to fourth into a low ash interval on reverse chord notes. Then, after a dotted crotchet rest, her first answering phrase lifts a third, falls on extended reverse melody notes, begun with a reverse ash interval, and finishes more hopefully with a high interval on a rising third. After a quaver rest, her second question takes the form of 2 melody note strophes, the second with those chromatics, a subtly distorted echo of her spouse's Valhalla encomium, which then drops a tritone into its reverse chord notes, a subtle appoggiatura effect. Its answer intensifies the texture with a low ash interval on a fourth to finish with chord notes and a rising minor third, an eerie foretaste of fate. Established by this complex melodic preface, she goes on to explain she wants a home, not a fortress, a thought she intones to one of the work's most identifiable, yet paradoxically little-used morphemes, never mind among its most misunderstood. Wotan calls this morpheme love's fascination, Kobe merely the Fricka motif. Newman and Holman favor Wotan's moniker, while Hutchison makes it the enchantment of love. Donington opts for love as fulfillment, and Sabor merely enchantment, possibly because its only recurrences outside Rheingold are during Siegfried, as the marveling Velsung contemplates the sleeper on Brunhilde's mountaintop with a mixture of fear and awe. Cook calls it domestic bliss, which seems much more in keeping with its overall use in the epic. He also contends it plays a formative part in the all-important redemption morpheme, whose vital contribution to the epic's denouement must be a major concern for any analysis. Yet this is one of those few cases where Cook seems to miscalculate. While, like redemption, Fricka's syntax is built on two identical phrases, capped by falling intervals, that's the extent of their similarities. This morpheme connotes more than what's found in previous commentary, symmetrical in quite a different way from redemption, while, given its infrequent recurrences, logically with more specific import than the poetically vague monikers other commentators suggest. Formally, it's organized in the way of the Meister's much-admired bar form, being two similar phrases roughly equivalent to stolen, followed by a third or abgesang. The initial downward line of the first stolen invokes the air to chord notes in the form of a static whirl-dash interval, ended as Cook notes by a descending seventh. However, the next stolen mixes reverse melody notes with a reverse ash interval, and capped in a downward fifth. This is hardly the symmetry of redemption, which Fricka's morpheme further complicates by extending in its abgesang, beginning with the descent on reverse melody notes to rise through the melody notes themselves into a rising triad, then sink again in a spear-like scale of extended reverse melody notes. Given these ambivalent syntactic cues, one might be tempted to dismiss this syntax as a caressingly sweet anomaly, Wagner groping for meaning through his unformed syntactic instincts. Yet the Meister has taken pains to make this a prominently new sonic landmark in what up to now has been a rather dry sequence. It's the goddess consort's vision of what Valhalla ought to be, and, keeping in mind Fricka is a nature spirit co-opted by nature's greatest foe, meaning Wotan, Cook tells us the morpheme's descending seventh carries important information which, along with redemption, is associated with the inspiring power of women. If such revelation is the product of any woman, that can only be Erda, mother of all inspiration. What's more, when such insights come to the drama's various characters, they frequently do so thanks to the Vala's operative loge, a fact that becomes clearer as the scene moves past this initial argument and the falling seventh takes a special place in its syntax. For now, Fricka as force of nature asserts her vision of a better Valhalla, Erda's imperative set against the willful god's abuses. Both stolen sink on equivocal whirl-dash intervals, the first static, the second reversed, and while the first stolen's terminating downward interval is the prescient seventh, the second's is an ominous plunging fifth. The morpheme also contains several melody note reversals, as opposed to only one melody note pulse in its original form, and chromatic into the bargain, directly followed by the rising triad already eloquent of betrayal. Most interesting, though still veiled in mystery, the syntax contains a melody note opposition with an eerie similarity to the giant turn, a module which has already informed Alberich's own desire for a faithful mate. Taken together, the morpheme's syntactic building blocks oppose its caressing sweetness, hiding within themselves the root of Fricka's concern, meaning her spouse abandoning her to commit his infidelities. From there, Fricka shifts her appeal to chastisement, spurred by first and second horns, whose peremptory static ash interval in its Valhalla form dovetails into a giant thump, an ominous warning shot after the last note of her domestic morphine on the word rast. This brief moment of natural grace banished along with string tremolos, she criticizes the fortress as a war keep, a bastion for world hegemony, her vocal twisting in chord note oppositions to move through a low ash interval on a harsh tritone, which, after melody notes and a plunging sixth, outlines chagrin to the words Auf wer und Wahl allein, an idea she tops with chord notes punctuated by a soft but marcato string crotchet. As strings march through first a semi-breve, then a procession of minim chords, she stresses her disapproval with another low-ash interval on an air de fourth, to fall on the same interval into a melody note pulse. Ended on chord notes, it echoes her original scold with its subtle hint of Alberich's Scene 1 passion. After only a semiquaver rest, she leaps up another air de fourth into something like her distortion of the giant turn, which she caps with a dire falling octave as she complains of the rastlosen Sturm zur Erregen, a line which also includes chagrin. She finishes her thought after a semiquaver rest by lifting a third into Flosshilda's heroic resistance, its rising note the fifth, which eventually becomes its wonted interval, to fall a sixth into a low-ash interval on reverse chord notes, her entire line filled with hints in both words and syntax that the castle's sole purpose is to flout with warlike conflict Erda's more peaceable design for the world. This discussion between the god and his consort suggests the trauma that's already begun to warp Fricka into her bitter Valkyria persona, which is more than resentment for her consort's infidelities, since her core disagreement with him is over the purpose of Valhalla, thus the god's future generally. Shaw accepts the judgment from Wotan's lips. In that majestic burg he is to rule with Fricka and through her over the humble giants. Cook expands the idea with an analysis of Fricka's motives as he sees them. She is even more devoted to dominion and law than Wotan is, since she wants both to remain fixed immutably. She begged Wotan to have Valhalla built as a permanent home to keep him in. Yet Fricka's text, never mind the adjacent syntax, contradicts the harsh spin given it by Shaw and Cook. If there's a flavor of coercion in the goddess's intent, it's one of love, not tyranny, her approach to kill with kindness. Her idea of Valhalla is as a home for love, not war or even the domination of law. She longs to hold Wotan, it's true, but not by force. Rather, she hopes to lure him with something of greater value than strife, infidelity, and rigid laws. In short, she argues for natural love, and her entire text revolves around Freya, goddess of love. But the syntax implies a strong flavor of ambivalence as well. In his famed 1854 letter to Rheingold, the Meister famously takes lengthy pains to explain that love, or the lack of it, is pivotal to all humans, hence his fictional couple's disagreement and the specific relation of that conflict to his epic. The firm bond which binds them both sprung from the involuntary error of a love that seeks to prolong itself beyond the stage of necessary change and to obtain mutual guarantees in contravention of what is eternally new and subject to change in the phenomenal world. This bond constrains them both to the mutual torment of a loveless union. As a result, the remainder of the poem is concerned to show how necessary it is to acknowledge change, variety, multiplicity, and the eternal newness of reality and of life, and to yield to that necessity. It's in precisely this light Wotan defends himself against his consort, yet the way in which he does so suggests the rationale given to Rheingold isn't the whole truth of the matter. Indeed, a more complex dynamic is at work here even than Wagner himself knew, whose mind was at the time very much on his own loveless match with his wife Minna. Put simply, Wotan is more guilty of crimes against love than is Fricka, his willingness to barter Freya the immediate proof. Second clarinet answers Fricka's indictment by meandering up a pleasant measure arpeggio, which, floated on second violin viola tremolos, continues in a full pulse of her domestic syntax, roughly doubled by the god's vocal, a deceptively mild response which seems to accept his consort's apron strings while stressing the morpheme's core of syntactic ambivalence. Wotan's use of it, in truth, is only to defend his haughty prerogative. His vocal rendition slyly apes Fricka while altering her version with a single telling stroke. Like her, doubled by second clarinet, his first stolen sinks on chord notes into a static ash interval ended by the seventh. But then, in defense of his theft from nature, his next stolen climbs back an octave on a low ash interval. Hotly equivocal signs, particularly in this instance. Avoiding its melody note opposition, he then broadly sketches the Abgesang's remainder, with no further embroidery until, as the dialogue's steady duple time changes to triple, 3 Valhalla ash intervals on third trumpet, bass trumpet sweep it aside to weave through his next defiant vocal. These nervous static pulses surround his vocal, his static notes bracketing a rising triad, as recently embodied in the god's own triumphant praise for Valhalla. Its sense of menace stronger here, and subtly underlined by a timpani roll. Descending from the triad with an ominous fifth, Wotan goes on to assert his rights to Ich mir von außen gewinne die Welt, as the brass choir, silent during Fricka's complaints, elbows the strings completely aside. Above its 2 pulses of Valhalla Part 1's ubiquitous variant, he sings a pair of heroic melody note conclusions, shaped in the form of his earlier encomium, a thorough co-opting of nature's power. We'll leave it here at the nub of Wotan's self-defense. The next video picks up where this one leaves off in Dover's full score, the first stave of page 94. As always, thanks for watching, and please do leave your comments. Time and energy allowing, I'll do everything I can to respond. Lastly, as all YouTubers know, your subscription to this channel by itself is a huge assist in completing this vast project. Hit the bell to be notified of the next videos. With luck and your support, there's a lot more to come.